Hello, dear chess lovers. Today we are discussing the good knight versus bad bishop scenario. One of the most typical and nicest middle game and end game patterns to know in chess. It's white to play in this position. Please evaluate this position, folks. I'm not asking for specific moves, but how do you evaluate a position like this? Is this a desirable endgame for white or black in this position? And we're going to discuss the reasons why. Of course, the title of this video is giving away, right? It's about the good knight versus bad bishop in this position. We will see different motifs, recurrent patterns, and how to identify and go for those situations where our beautiful knight can dominate a bad bishop. Clearly, the knight is much better than the bishop in this position. Why? First of all, the activity, right? The knight is placed in this beautiful c5 outpost. It's a very stable square, and knights like stable posts in chess, versus the bishop on c8, a terribly blocked piece, has no square to escape, even to move, lacking mobility, plus the bishop is tied down in guarding the weak pawn on e6. That's like the worst case scenario for the bishop, right? In general, our pieces hate to be tied down in guarding a weak pawn in chess. So that's a beautiful version for white. Plus, the king is also much stronger than the opposing king. So in this case, we can say white is combining these two huge positional advantages to reach a winning endgame. I can show you, for example, how white wins from this position. Let's say you go f4. White already starts playing for Zugzwang, by the way, the sharpest endgame weapon, according to Carsten Lüller. And as you can see, black cannot move a single pawn. If the pawn moves here on g6, then I will even push h3, and at some point your pawn moves will run out. That's exactly why they tried bishop d7 in this game. But here, white finds one more little maneuvering to post his knight to a square that it can attack two different targets at the same time. Can you find that idea, folks? It's white to play. Yes, it's about knight b3 to d4. The knight is a very flexible piece, can hop around, right, to a dark square, to a light square, back and forth. That's the ideal dream square for the knight, because from here it's attacking both of these pawns on e6 and b5, thus tying down the bishop even more. You see, now the bishop can no longer move from d7. It's totally frozen because both of these pawns will be hanging otherwise. White took its time to reach this dream square for both of their pieces. The king is in a dream square, the knight is in a dream square, and black pieces cannot move. The bishop cannot move because of this, and the king cannot move because of the invasion on d6. What does it mean? It means black is almost in a Zugzwang position. It's only pawn moves that are left after g6. You tell me what's next move that forces a resignation. Of course, we go h4. Zugzwang, black cannot move a single pawn, a single piece. If the king goes to f7, comes king d6 invasions, and everything is dropping for black, right? If king e8, I can even take on e6, and the game is totally won for white. Now you know that dream endgame and how we won with white pieces. Can you please choose the right move here for white, folks? It's white to play and reach a desirable and a dream state from this position. You're a great player. The art of exchanging pieces. By removing that knight from the board, white is creating a good knight versus bad bishop scenario, but we need one more move here. What is the correct follow-up here, folks, with white pieces? Of course, we go e5, we freeze this pawn on e6, we fix it as a pawn that is limiting the black's bishop's mobility, right? And of course, you want to slowly improve your king to the queen side and take it from there. This is already a dream endgame for white. Knight is amazing versus bishop is terrible, and also the king will reach those central squares much more easily than the black king. For example, the game went like this: king e7, king e3, king d8, king d4, and after f6, should we take on f6, folks, or should we wait for black to take on e5? That's a very typical positional decision, of course. Yeah, we just play b4, we freeze this pawn on b5 as a target, and we say, please take that pawn, because if you take that pawn, it's only helping our king, and plus you're giving yourself one more weakness on e6. And that's how we have reached this position that I've shown you at the beginning of this video, right? So this was a nice follow-up, nice link between the middle game stage to an end game stage, where you have these extreme scenarios in mind, because you need to learn this first, right? It's about chunks and patterns. We need to get used to, familiarize ourselves to those very typical endgame patterns, because if you know, for example, the evaluation of this position, then your exchange decisions will improve from the middle game. There's much more structure to your thinking earlier stages of the game. And here, for example, black is suffering. What are the conditions for good knight, bad bishop? We will discuss more. But this is a good start. Bishops hate defending their pawns like that, to be tied down. They need mobility. That's why, for example, Capablanca said we should generally place our pawns on the opposite color of our own bishop, so there's coordination between those units, but also the bishop has mobility, right? Can freely roam. While knights like stability, the knights are short-range pieces. They need static weaknesses, those long-term targets like outposts. Ideally, they want to also attack targets in the enemy camp, because the knight is a very flexible piece, can change colors, but the bishop is a colorblind creature. This bishop can no longer reach those dark squares, and that's why white is winning in this position. To consolidate my point, it's a study, endgame study. It's white to play, folks. Can you find the winning continuation for white in this position? There are only 2 pawns left. It seems like black is very close to a draw, but in fact, white is winning. Please stop the video and find the entire sequence for white from this position, folks. Well, let's do it together, folks. First things first. The bishop is terrible because it's blocked by its own pawn, right? That's not something that bishops like in chess. Plus, the king is in Siberia. Plus, the knight on c6 can be used potentially to capture that bishop that is running short of squares, right? This bishop cannot move anywhere right now, but how does white win this position? Of course, we need to somehow fix the bishop even more. That's why king g6 is a great move. This king is paving way for the knight to reach the f7 square, while also removing those squares from the bishop. This bishop is lacking mobility after king b7. Well, there's nothing else left, right? The bishop cannot move. The king only is a single square because of the knight's limitations. So, of course, that's a beautiful study. Check. That's a very important check, because our knight is reaching the ideal destination on f7, and the bishop can no longer move to e5, and our 2 units are totally trapping the bishop on h8, and the game is already won because of this, right? King f5 followed by king e4. We're going to capture that pawn as well, and white is winning this position. So this study teaches us, right, what bishops hate in chess, and the flexibility of the knight as well, can change colors and capture the enemy bishop like this, right? Even this pure endgame with only single pawns left, the bishop was suffering. So that's a great conclusion also from this study. Knights are great blockaders in chess, folks. It's black to play. This position was given by Nimzowitsch in his book My System. White has an extra pawn right now. Can you please evaluate this position? How would you judge? Would you rather play with the white pieces or with the black pieces in this position, and why? First things first, folks, look at the knight on c5. That's what knights want in chess. Stable squares, ideally blockading spots where they can both stop the enemy pawns but also do something positive to our position. Now look at the bishop on f1. Again, we see once again, right? The bishop hemmed in by its own pawns on those light squares. Bishops hate when the central pawns are blocked on the same color as the bishop. They hate seeing that because they are so limited in this position. Also, the bishop has no targets to attack in the enemy camp. The rook is much better than the white rook as well. This pawn is tying down the white rook, and this pawn is also tying down the bishop, let's say. What is the correct plan for black? Please look at the pawn structure and generate a plan for black. Yes, it's an endgame. Endgames are about creating passed pawns. Black has 3 versus 2 on the king side. Thus, f5 is a great plan. Black is simply generating a passed pawn on the king side and claim that despite being a pawn down, their pieces and also the king will be much more active than their counterparts. White is already in the back foot. They need accurate defense to survive in this position, because even the king is cut off on the second rank. Just look at all the targets on the position. That's also what knights want. They need those stable targets, fixed pawn structures that they can slowly maneuver and take the game slowly, because they are very flexible. They can change colors, as I said, but the bishop is generally relying on dynamics in chess. I will make another video about the good bishop versus bad knight, and I will talk about these dynamical factors much more in that video. Let's talk about some chess classics, okay? That's a very famous game between Saidy and Fischer. So in this position, white has the bishop pair versus bishop and knight. And black, Fischer, played the move bishop c2. Now, given what you've learned so far in this video, folks, should white take those bishops off, or should white keep those bishops, let's say, with the move like bishop f3? How would you play with the white pieces in this position? You're a great player if you actually suggested the move bishop f3, because white needs to preserve the bishop pair. White should generally avoid a bad bishop versus good knight endgame, which was allowed by Saidy against Fischer, right? This way, for example, it's not easy for black to play bishop e, at least for an advantage, because bishop e4, well, if you reiterate your good knight versus bad bishop endgame, I can refuse and I can go back. I can also stop rook c2, and the game is actually balanced in this position, okay? So bishop c2 was Fischer's move. Saidy in this game played bishop e3. That was a positional mistake, I would say, because objectively this is still holdable for white, but Fischer is now envisioning a good knight versus bad bishop endgame. In fact, the game is going to a pure knight versus bishop endgame because of this back rank issue. Black cannot take on b2, right? So Fischer took on c1, and we reached a knight versus bishop endgame. How would you judge this endgame? I think the same idea. It's a symmetrical pawn structure, which usually favors the knights, and the central pawn that is hemmed in on the same color as the bishop. This officially makes this bishop a bad bishop. Also, the bishop has no targets on the queen side to attack, right? Which means black can take his time, slowly improve their position on the king side. The king will get activated. The knight is a very flexible piece. It can jump to light square, dark square, back and forth, as Fischer showed in his actual game. And it becomes practically difficult to play with the white pieces, despite the engine will defend this position probably with white, right? So Fischer played knight e7. He immediately puts his knight to e6. That's the first stage. He's putting pressure on the weak pawn on d4. Thus, he's tying down the white pieces in his position. This was also nice because he's not allowing any kind of king invasions later with moves like this. Now comes the second stage, right? Our king has to be activated in the endgame, obviously. So what do you think Fischer did in this position, folks? Great player you are. If you found the move h5, this paves way for the king activation on the king side using this route, right? Of course, bishop e3, you see, bishop is lacking targets. White is forced to passive defense in this position. Look at the function of this pawn as well. It's clearly cutting off the king on d3, and black is going to improve his king, just like here, right? a4, king f5. You see, also the function of h5, there's no more g4 moves. The king is reached a beautiful spot in f5, and comes the second stage, because black is not in a hurry. In an endgame like this, good knight versus bad bishop, long-term advantage for black. You should not hurry. You should take your time, because white has no counterplay whatsoever. You can slowly improve your advantage. You can ask so many questions. You can play this game until tomorrow with the black pieces, because white basically is forced to passivity, right? That's exactly how Fischer actually won this game, folks. Comes g5, further improving the king side. Maybe at some point you can go g4 to create some further weaknesses on the king side, right? King f2, knight d8. Now Fischer is showing us one more idea. Perhaps this knight can go to c6 at some point to put pressure on d4 this way. Maybe it can later jump to b4 to d3, right? As you see, Fischer is introducing so many ideas, but white is basically passive. He needs to make these moves to defend their weaknesses. It's a very, very depressing position to play actually with the white pieces, if you pay close attention, folks. King f5 back, Fischer is shuffling his pieces. He's not in a hurry. f6, a very, very quiet move, right? He says, okay, you have no counterplay. I will see where I take the game from here. King g6. Now Fischer chooses this plan of expansion on the king side with f5 and f4. You see, just driving the bishop, and comes the next phase. The knight is going to this potentially this f5 square to put pressure on the white position on the king side. h3, knight f5. You can see already after king d3, black is introduced one more idea in this position. This was the point behind the move g4, and also this very pawn structure allows black a nice looking pawn break. Does it work for black? How would you play with the white pieces here, folks? With the black pieces here? Please stop the video and find an improving plan for black, because it looks like you reached a maximum, right? The knight is achieved this f5 outpost. The king cannot use that square anymore. But for the moment, white is defending all of their weaknesses. So you need to create a second front, so to speak. And that's the move g4, of course. Black was keeping this break in the back of his head, right? At some point, this break could be played. And that's the right time, according to Fischer, because after takes, the knight returned back to h6, and now no one can guard this pawn on g4 anymore. And also this way, you gain access to f5 with your king, and potentially even to e4, right? Because look at the change in the pawn structure. This f3 pawn disappeared as a result of the break. That's why now black has gained access to e4 for their pieces, right? Just look at the improvement for black. And here white mistakenly goes bishop e1, and now black is winning. The only drawing move for white was the move king e2. This was the only defense for white, because the point is this: the bishop controls that knight, let's say, and if the knight ever moves somewhere, then bishop h2 and king f3 will follow to put pressure on the weak pawn on f4. This was the only drawing idea for white, just like here. King f3 is a very important move, and now it's like a mutual zugzwang, right? If the knight moves, comes bishop h2, and that's annoying bishop to put pressure on that pawn, right? For example, after knight h5, you can play a5, and black is no pawn moves left, and you can even exchange the last pair of pawns like this. Again, white needs to be so careful to not end up in a lost pawn endgame, but here that's actually a drawn pawn endgame. It's an objective draw. After king e2, a good move. Knight takes g4, king f3, yeah, bishop g1, king f5, king f3. We can look at one more line here. Let's say a5. What if I stopped all your pawns? What if I force you to make a move here? Yeah, because it looks like the bishop is in zugzwang, right? The king cannot move as well, because otherwise king e4 is coming. It looks like if you go b3, b6, right, your pawn moves are running out. But here, instead of going b3, white goes, you tell me. Yes, they go g3, a very important resource, because defending side should generally trade the pawns that will remove the attacking units from the enemy position, and that's exactly how white is achieving a draw. There's no king e4 because the knight will be hanging, and white is just surviving minimally in this position, right, by this accurate, very accurate defense. And here, even here, white needs to be so careful, but this is objectively a drawn endgame. Just shows us all the practical difficulties to defend a position like this. Saidy in the actual game went bishop e1, and there was no turning back for Fischer. Knight takes g4, and now king f5 is also coming, right? Just beautiful, beautiful. The king cannot move because of king e4. The bishop needs to keep an eye on this e3 square as well. So you see, it's becoming very dangerous for white to play this position. Fischer, he did not go to e3 directly because that will allow g3, right? He takes his time, he improves further. Maybe the knight can go to h5 and so on. Now the king g4 is also an idea, folks, right? So you see, he's totally busted. White is no defense. And now comes the next phase. Well, that's my point, right? You need to know your basic endgames. Here, Fischer goes knight g3 check and invites a pawn endgame. Is this a winning pawn endgame for black, folks? You tell me. Should we capture back with the pawn or with the king? Of course, with the king. The king is much more active. And here, you tell me the winning mechanism. That's easy. We can even go f3 directly, force this trade, and our king is going to collect everything on the queen side, and the game is totally won for black. You see, once you achieve such a position, you can even transition to a winning pawn endgame because you have a much more active king in this position, right? So he played king d3, but then comes knight f5, and already here, the king is paralyzed in guarding this pawn, plus the knight introduces one more idea of playing knight h4 to attack the pawn on g2, and white cannot defend them all. Yeah, the next move for Fischer was, you tell me, knight h4, and here, well, if you take that knight, right, we end up in the same endgame basically, f3, and black is completely winning this position. So after knight h4, he tried a5, but this pawn finally dropped, and Fischer won the pawn on the king side after very careful play, and the entire thing just collapsed after f3, bishop g3. One final question for you folks. Would you directly go f2 and take that bishop in actual game? Or can you find Fischer's stronger move? If you see a good move, look for a better one. That's what applies in this position. It's about giving yourself more choices and to stop all counterplay and win the game as simple as possible. It's up to you here, folks. You're a great player if you found Fischer's move knight e3, because simply he wants to go to f5 with the knight and the bishop can no longer cover the f2 square, and then my pawn is just running to f2 and f1 and the game is over. There is zero counterplay given to the opponent and black wins. Saidy resigned after the move knight e3. Many of us mortals would just be impatient. We would go f2. But of course, who wants to calculate all these lines, right? The king is coming to the queen side with all these moves. King b6 is coming. Now, of course, black is winning. But who needs to calculate all these moves? Look at this, guys. The pawn is running, you to sacrifice your knight. And yes, after d4, you're still winning. But this calculation was completely unnecessary from this position. That's why Fischer played the move knight e3 and white resigned. Beautiful endgame play from Fischer. I guess the lessons are clear. That was a beautiful knight versus bad bishop endgame. Savable for white, but difficult to play in an actual game. Let's look at one more chess classic. This time, Botvinnik with white pieces. He already created a potentially good knight versus bad bishop middle game, and he envisions that black will go e5 next, so he plays the prophylactic move queen f4 to begin with. He's welcoming potential endgames after rook e8, and he's stopping e5. Maybe the queen will go to e5 to have a static advantage. After rook e8, castle short, he says, please go e5 because that's your only dynamical chance to change the picture. But of course, he's welcoming the endgame because he knows that potentially he's going to have a good knight versus bad bishop endgame scenario. And here, Botvinnik goes, you tell me the next move, folks. What is the way to further limit that bishop on d7? What is the correct move in this position, positionally speaking, to make the bishop even worse? You're a great player, folks, if you found the move f4, freezing the pawn on the same color as the bishop, also paving way for the king, because that's an endgame. Our king wants to play an active wall in this position. And you see, already here, you see the contours of this potential good knight versus bad bishop scenario. For example, if rook e3, the idea was this, king f2, rook e8, comes rook e1, and I want to trade all the rooks to reach this endgame. And here you see the king will reach to this d4 square. Maybe it can go to the queen side later on. This knight can be a blockading piece on d4, and the bishop sucks. There's no life whatsoever. A very, very bad endgame for black. That's exactly why after f4 he goes rook e7, but Botvinnik plays rook e1 anyways. He wants to trade one pair of rooks. That's usually a good policy because now there is zero counterplay left for black. If there were two rooks still on the board, they could generate some counterplay against our king, and now the advantage crystallizes, and white simply claims this knight will be better than this bishop. That's exactly correct. Botvinnik's judgment was correct. Now we'll see how he won this position, because it takes a real skill to convert a winning advantage. First, he stops d4. He repositions the rook to d2. He just sort of stops all kind of invasions on the second rank, but also at the right time, right? He's hinting at the move rook e2, because otherwise the king is cut off. And that's exactly why Botvinnik goes rook e2. He's welcoming this endgame, folks. Look at this. Now the knight can be a blockader on d4, and the king will definitely try to invade on e5, but maybe he will go to the queen side using this route. Okay? So that's exactly why rook e2 was a good move in this position. The opponent played rook b8 instead. But then comes king e3. You see, the rook is guarding this pawn as well. Now we can improve our king. He's not shying away from pure knight versus bad bishop endgame. The king is a very strong piece. After king f6, to stop king e5 invasions, comes the next phase, folks. This knight is not doing much. You don't need this knight right now to stop rook e4 invasions. So the knight has to move, but where? Maybe you can already stop the video and find the next move for white. Yes, folks, Botvinnik played the move knight a2. That's a multi-purpose move because I want to play knight b4 to block your rook. That's why your rook has to leave that spot. But once the rook leaves that spot, this gives me an idea to execute my plan. Please form a plan for white, folks. What are you seeing on the queen side? I'm seeing 3 versus 2 pawn majority on the queen side. Of course, we are going b4 because one of the other points of the endgame is to be able to create a passed pawn, right? He execute all the right ideas. First, he improves his king. That's what you do in the endgame. Then he's forming a plan in generating a passed pawn on the queen side at some point. Now also the knight is free to go back to c3 or maybe some other squares, right? g5. One more question. Should we take that pawn or should we play g3 instead? A very nice positional puzzle for you folks. You're a great player if you play the move g3 because this pawn is very important for us to freeze the bishop on d7, right? We want that pawn to remain on f5 because if the pawn remains on f5, then this bishop sucks. If you take on g5, black is almost gaining equality because f4 is coming next and the bishop is becoming a better piece, right? f4, g4, maybe rook h8, and black is gaining counterplay on the king side. That's exactly why Botvinnik very quickly probably play the move g3. Positional move also cuts the king off completely. Look at the function of this pawn on f4, folks. After takes, we take back, comes a6. Well, black again has no dynamical play left. White can slowly improve. And again, just like Fischer example, white can take his time because black has no counterplay. White will slowly create the winning play on the queen side. Rook g8. What's the winning plan? You tell me. How do we create a passed pawn? Yes, a4. Now we are hinting at a potential b5 break because that will inevitably create a target on d5 or give us a passed pawn on c5. It's as simple as that. Simple chess. By playing a4, he wants to simply create a passed pawn and win the game that way. Rook g4. Should we defend the pawn or should we ditch the pawn? You tell me. You stop the video, folks. Well, we have all the static advantages. Black has a single attack on the pawn. Botvinnik simply played rook f2 and he says, you know what? There's only a single attack. I will defend my very important pawn because that pawn is stopping your pieces but also killing your bishop. That's a very, very nice pawn to defend. I'm creating a new course on Chessable about this. Should we defend or ditch those pawns? In this case, that's a very important pawn that should be defended. That's only a temporary inactivity for the rook. Yes, your rook was a more active piece, but your claim is very simple, right? Your pawn is coming to b5 and that will paralyze the black pieces anyways, and your rook will gain further activation later on. That's a very nice positional move, rook f2, and after bishop e6, well, black is suffering. I mean, maybe rook g1 comes to mind, but then comes b5 anyways, right? And you see, the rook cannot make any check on the d-file. If you take twice, then your d5 pawn is hanging with check, and that's a very, very nice position for white. Look at our pieces. All the units are beautiful. King d6 is coming next. Invasion. White is simply better in this position, folks. So after rook f2, he tried bishop e6, but then comes Botvinnik's next move, of course b5. And this is giving us a passed pawn on the c-file. It's as simple as that, right? By those pawn exchanges, you achieved your goal. Now this pawn is roaming and there is no one that can stop the pawn if they want to stop it. Their pieces will get tied down and your rook will gain activation. This is such a nice endgame to follow, folks. Rook g1. Well, Botvinnik is a very prophylactic player. He doesn't want to see any checks. That's why knight c3, right? He's keeping full control. There is no rook d1 check and this pawn is now free to roam. There is nothing stopping this pawn, but before pushing the pawn, he looks at his rook. That's a bad piece. How do we improve that bad piece? You tell me. Of course, rook b2. Now the rook is gaining further activity. This king can always go to e5 on the next move. And you see, white's pieces are becoming too much for black to handle. Please take a stock and evaluate this position. Just look how terrible that bishop is still in this position. d5 and f5 pawns are really burying that piece. He tried rook f1, one final attack on the pawn. Botvinnik tried to defend this way. That's also nice because now everything is protected, right? This knight is protected, this pawn is protected, and the king can reach this beautiful spot e5, and we keep full control. We can even push the pawn at our leisure if you want to, right? Rook e1, it's already lost for black, comes king e5. You see, every single piece has reached their ideal destination, folks. That's a beautiful story to actually observe. And of course, after d4, that's the only chance for the bishop to gain activity. I can take on d4. That pawn was too much for you to give away because that was your only pass pawn. And now the game will end like this. I will show you the final phase. King h5, he wants to get some activation, but it's already too late. Comes rook e2. You see how Botvinnik keeps control until the very end. No counterplay for the opponent. And he waits before pushing that pawn. He's waiting for the right time to push that pawn after king g4, king e5. Full control, full domination. Botvinnik was a very, very prophylactic player. He wants to keep full control in the entire game. That's why he's playing this way. Knight d4. Well, after h5, you tell me. You stop the video here, folks. We are searching for a nice tactic for white here that win one more pawn perhaps. Okay, so please stop the video and engage in a short calculation that justify your move. You're a great player, folks, if you came up with the move knight takes f5, because if the bishop recaptures the knight, you tell me the next move. Of course, h3, and the king is overworked. After takes, no one is stopping this pawn anymore, and white is winning. That's a beautiful 5-ply calculation. That's the first ply, second ply, third ply, fourth ply, fifth ply, and you can stop and evaluate this position as winning for white, right? Botvinnik, of course, he was also a great calculator. Knight takes f5, and the position collapsed. Black resigned after these moves already. He resigned. We can see how the game could have gone. Look at those pawns, folks. If the bishop comes and stops that guy, we are running the other guy. The bishop is overworked. After this comes f7, and white wins by queen promotion. That's a beautiful endgame. I love this endgame, folks, and it all stems already from this position, I would say, right? He's envisioning a potential good knight versus bad bishop scenario. That's why he's taking that knight away from the board, and that's why he's anticipating this ensuing position. He's stopping e5 with queen f4, and he's, you know what? He's welcoming good knight versus bad bishop endgame. That's my point. With masters have those long-term patterns and chunks in their brains that make the entire process much more efficient. Botvinnik is engaging in the art of exchanging pieces to reach a dream state and see how he converts this position. You can learn tremendously from such chess classics, but we are doing in this episode is to understand the contours, basic patterns to highlight good knight and a bad bishop scenario. And definitely this game highlights these factors. Just like in the Fischer example, the central pawns were blocked on the same color as the bishop, while the knight had free hand to go to a light square, dark square, and see how white improved all of their pieces. In all these examples, we also understand one thing, folks. You also need your king's support, don't you think? Like in most of these positions, to be able to win the position, you also need to play with an active king. And obviously, right, we generally need two weaknesses in chess to convert an advantage. Good knight and bad bishop is one weakness, and usually the second weakness is created by the king's activity or creating a passed pawn on the other side of the board. As a final position, I will give you homework on an evaluation exercise. That's a game of Ulf Andersson with white pieces. These endgames are also called Andersson endgames, folks, where a knight and a bishop are combined. If the knight side is better, those endgames are now called Andersson endgames because he won so many classical games in those structures where he was using his knight so beautifully and flexibly to outplay the bishop that was a colorblind creature. My question is this: it's black to play in this position. What makes a knight a better piece here? Maybe it's you don't even maybe agree. Please tell me, please give me feedback on YouTube. Maybe you don't think that white is already better because it looks like a different position than what we've seen so far, right? It looks like that's a position that the bishop is a happy piece. I mean, there is no central pawn, right? There is no central pawn that is blocking the bishop's scope in this position. So what makes this position even a better position for white? It looks like black is following Capablanca's rule in placing their pawns on the opposite color of their bishops. So what makes this position an exception? Let's discuss, because that's also great for learning, so you don't overgeneralize. You also understand the nuances and exceptions to the rules and so on, so you don't follow it blindly, so to speak, right? So that's an Andersson endgame. I even made a video about this 3 years ago. I will post a link here on this video for deep analysis of this entire game. But for the moment, I want you to give me a couple of points behind white's setup, and maybe you can also tell me a couple of winning plans for white in this position, or maybe for black. Which side do you think is playing for a win and why? Okay, I'll probably make other videos about this series, folks. That's a very rich concept. Good knight versus bad bishop. And in one of those videos, I can revisit this position and I can tell you exactly what was going on. The basic points are clear, I guess, folks. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Please give me feedback on YouTube, whether you agree or disagree, or you can even explain to me your thoughts. because that's a great tool for learning. When you explain a concept using your own words, discuss ideas, that memory consolidates. That leads to much longer lasting learning. So I will be answering all of your questions on YouTube, I promise. I'm here to help you improve your game, and we're gonna build our patterns one by learning those very typical, important endgame motifs. This will make your middle game play much stronger, and you will become an overall better player. For further information of this very topic, please check my Chessable course, The Art of Exchanging Pieces, that highlights so many good knight versus bad bishop scenarios and how can we trade the pieces in the middle game to reach our dreams. Otherwise, please give me a like and subscribe. That's very important for me, folks, to be able to produce similar content for you. And don't hesitate asking anything on YouTube, and I will catch you very soon. Bye bye.